Sam Harris and his Making Sense podcast. Yeah, I've fallen out with Sam Harris. I'm sure he'll be destroyed to discover this. Mainly because between the time of him releasing the Can We Pull Back from the Brink episode, post George Floyd, from that timeline up to the timeline that followed very quickly of me sort of gathering my head all of the Democrats being implicated in the mess that we're in right now. The Democrats, they set that fire or built that hornet's nest, choose your analogy, back in the 60s, right up to George Floyd, and then what has happened since George Floyd after that. In Sam Harris's podcast, he lays out the facts beautifully, in his dulcet tones, and you're very informed, and he's trying to appease his audience of, there's a lot of people who are for Trump and against Trump in his audience, to just calm down and listen to him. So he spells out all of those facts of, the size of the black population, and the amount of crime they commit and how disproportionate it is. More white unarmed people are killed by police, but even though they make up the majority of the population, the interaction rate of young black men with the police shows just how often they come into contact with the police, and that explains their numbers. So you've got all these facts laid out, and he just never draws his mind back to when the Democrats started all of this bullshit. He does talk about young black men resisting arrest. I think he mentioned something about no fathers. He never implicates the Democrats at all, because he can't, because he wants Trump out. And if he says anything bad against the Democrats, his fan base, but his friend base, he'll stop getting invited to certain parties or something. I don't know. But he never goes right back to the origin story. If we want to talk about George Floyd's origin story, I don't mean to pick on George Floyd himself, but this was the last confrontation with the police that has set us off in a world of bullshit now. But the origin story of that person running into the police started back with the Great Society Act that I mentioned in the other video. Sam Harris didn't mention any of that. He didn't mention Biden's crime bill. He may have briefly, but he didn't really paint a very full picture. I've listened to the podcast a few times. It's a very long podcast. He mentions the war on drugs, because that was the Republicans. But because of his Trump derangement syndrome, he just cannot lay out the path that brought us to this post-George Floyd mess. And I find that so disingenuous, because Sam Harris's brand... it's fine for, say, a celebrity to avoid talking about, inconvenient truths like that. But not Sam Harris. He has built his brand on a truth-seeking missile. He's anti-woke enough to bring that up. And he's also had to correct some nut jobs on the left that have completely purposely distorted some of the things Trump has said, and to Sam's credit, has cleared those up, with the Charlottesville situation, with the very fine people on both sides. See, even Sam Harris, with his Trump derangement syndrome, still had enough integrity to clear that up with some of his leftist nut jobs. But the fact that he spent all that time on that Can We Pull Back from the Brink podcast and didn't link the Democrat origin story of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Act that basically incentivized black people to sit there and do nothing and wait for checks, removing fathers from the home. Kids don't get the guidance and the discipline they need to become the wonderful human beings that we know they have the potential to be, and decided to turn to a life of crime. I just don't get it. I found that really disingenuous and really disappointing. But I can see why he conveniently decided to avoid fleshing out his podcast with some of those facts that would take the Democrats back to the scene of the original crime, where their fingerprints are all over this mess. But because Trump is here, he can't paint that picture clearly enough and has got to fog up the lens. Brett Weinstein had glowing appraisal of that podcast, and he asked John McWhorter, what did you think of my podcast, and glowing reviews, because John McWhorter is on the left, and as great as John McWhorter is, if you want to talk shit about Trump, he will join you. But John McWhorter is fantastic and a clear, good thinker. But the two of them, there's no way anyone was going to admit that he could have talked about the Democrats' culpability in this entire timeline. So, and then because he was sort of touting at the start of that podcast that, look, he's going to do this solo and he's not going to have sort of some black intellectual on to back him up, which, so what? If Sam Harris can't be brave enough without saying how brave he is, that's pretty pathetic. I still listen to Sam Harris, but I can't tell you, don't worship anyone. I don't worship Sam Harris. It's just that when we were going through all that trouble with Islam and the left just apologizing for Islam constantly, and that whole thing with Sam Harris confronting Ben Affleck, that was great. Can you imagine if Sam Harris used that same truth-seeking missile and applied it to the Democrats and drew that line back from George Floyd all the way to the 1960s, where the Democrats thought, I know what we'll do. We'll just put the black community on the couch and pay them to sit there and vote for us. If he had done that, he'd be super Sam Harris. There was no sign of it in that podcast. He's so against the woke, but he's going to vote for the woke with Biden and Harris. This is a direct quote from another podcast that he did. Even if I believe Tara Reid, so Tara Reid is the woman that worked with Biden back in the 90s, I think, and has accused him since of sexual assault. It's still her story, but it has far more connection to reality than Blasey Ford against Kavanaugh. Because Sam Harris basically just condemned Kavanaugh based on his Trump derangement syndrome. This guy was being appointed by Trump. So what's Sam Harris going to do? Jump in with the mob and condemn Kavanaugh. Because he was using this. If any time you see someone use hear someone use the phrase, I think we can assume, and it's not hard to imagine. Those two phrases. He would use those phrases when talking about Kavanaugh. I think we can assume Kavanaugh is lying because blah, blah, blah. I hate that shit. It's not hard to imagine anything. Stop imagining stuff. Just get facts. Is Sam Harris not the facts man? Just the facts, Sam. I still like him, but for a truth-seeking missile like Sam, I have also got to be a truth-seeking fan. And if I see something amiss, I've got to talk about it. Now, if I'm wrong about this, and he has fleshed this out in some other podcast, then tell me and I'll look at it. I want to be informed, not misinformed. I'm aware that I can misinform myself. Right, this is the quote. Even if I believe Tara Reid, there's almost nothing Biden could be guilty of that would disqualify him in an election against Trump, given what an existential danger I perceive Trump to be. This sounds hyperbolic, but it really isn't. Even if he is a murderer, I'm confident that he will be a better president than Trump. Even if he turns out to have done this to Tara Reid, I don't see this as a hypocritical position. What the fuck? That's word for word, because I wrote it down and transcribed it from the podcast. How can you condemn Trump with this? How can you call someone a monster and then speak like that? Does that not sound hideous? He goes from completely, with no evidence whatsoever, condemning Kavanaugh to letting Biden off the hook, even if he has done this to Tara Reid. And then at the 47-minute section of his podcast, don't get swept up in your emotions, while he shares crime data refuting the woke protest on police brutality. So this could be an argument to rid Sam of his repulsion to Trump. Don't get swept up in your emotions. I mean, look at the data of what Trump has done for the black community and let go of your emotions, because Sam himself has listed repulsion as an emotion, so not something to base any facts in, and realize you could possibly be wrong about Trump. That Middle East peace deal between the Arab state and Israel, I mean, that is groundbreaking, but the slipstream media, they don't want to talk about it. You know, if Obama did it, I mean, he would get another Nobel Prize. All the money he's giving to historically black colleges, the First Step Act, I haven't heard Sam say anything about the First Step Act. I never see Sam Harris say, I can't stand Trump because he did this to these people, or this policy doesn't work, or what does he think he's doing? He just always says, we're losing standing on the world stage, and he's abandoning norms. Abandoning norms? Where have the norms been getting the Democrats? They've gotten nowhere. They've had 60 years since the 60s, and the black community is in the same position it's always been in. It is a problem to remain a problem, not a problem looking for a solution. And then another criticism of his, of Trump, which just makes absolutely no sense coming from Sam Harris's mouth, is Trump's treatment of the press. Now, we all know about Trump's statement of fake news, which is poetry, because that's what they are. And Sam Harris has said the media is now run by children. Sam said recently on that podcast that I was mentioning, all the Trump supporters are not all racist, but all the racists support Trump. What the hell? So basically he's just said that there are no racists supporting Biden. Geez, that must be a weight off his shoulders. Really, Sam? There are no racists in the Democratic camp? Are you kidding? His argument is that even just the existence of Trump is the cause of all the irrational thinking and disability in being able to have real conversations. So no one has agency in the age of Trump? The fact that Trump has banned the very bullshit critical race theory that Sam is apparently fighting against should tell you quite a bit of where Trump stands on the most vital conversations that are happening in America today. This anti-America bullshit is why we can't have a conversation. And Sam's pursuit of truth seems to stop at the Democratic Party, as if Trump is a traffic cop forcing Sam off the road. He refuses to apply the same critical thinking to the Democrats that he does to Islam. He knows he'll lose his audience, or a big chunk of it, if he calls out the left on this bullshit, the bullshit of acknowledging that all of those cities are run by Democrats, the ones that are on fire. So Sam, this is it's getting awkward. So people like these that I have admired in the past have their boats securely anchored to the port of the Democrats. Knowing now what I do about the Democratic Party and the degree to which I have been willfully fooled, I fooled myself, by them into thinking they were the good guys, has left me to wonder about people like Sam Harris and Bill Maher. What do I do with these two? These two guys have been anti-woke and for truth, but their deep-seated hatred for Donald Trump has locked them into a box. Imagine now if Sam Harris came out and said, I was wrong about Trump. He even has on his podcast a question he asks his guests, something like, was there a moment you knew you were wrong and changed your mind for the better? Trump is not the ideal person to hitch your wagon to, but who is? Trump is anti-woke. Sam is anti-woke. Bill is anti-woke. I think I see a way out of this, guys. If we can't do a post-mortem on certain factions of Western civilization, then we're no better than sacred religious dogmas that Sam is so against. Sam Harris has been carefully peeling off the band-aid very slowly, bit by bit, but now it requires one swift pull so we can all see the DNC for who they are. I've loved listening to Sam Harris for years, but he's turning out to be a bit of a bad detective who is ignoring newly discovered evidence that would close the case and punish the perpetrators. This is in reference to the Can We Pull Back from the Brink. I've written this on my iPad. Once Sam Harris gives all the facts, he then puts it all on the police to become more effective. This is not due to ineffective policing, this situation that we're in. It's due to callously ineffective governance. We see these cities run by Democrats burning down, businesses destroyed, and people beaten to death. What more proof do we need that Democrats not only cannot contain these cities, but are the reason these cities are hornets' nests of violence? They have run these cities for 100 years or so, and their kidnapping-like grip they have on their citizens is so strong that they never got voted out of office. Sam Harris will not implicate the Democrats' bloody hands in this war zone they've left for the police to clean up. The onus is not on police to govern its citizens, but the leaders of these cities seem only too eager to blame the police for their clear lack of ability to run their cities. The best solution they can come up with to fix this problem is to defund and abolish the police, obeying the insane wishes of their woke citizens while they commit more crime, while ignoring their law-abiding citizens who live with the fear of being killed on a daily basis. Punishing the very people who risk their lives every day to keep people safe is the last act of desperate incompetence. Sam Harris was having a live Q&A, this was a few weeks ago. You could submit questions. Because Trump has banned critical race theory being taught in federal agencies, well, it's something that you would assume that Sam Harris would be on board with, but at the very least make a comment about. So there was just utter silence. I keep up to date with his tweets. He never mentioned anything about it when Trump did this, which, you know, this is ammunition, is compatible with Sam's weapon against the woke. But because Trump did it, he can't actually say anything about it. So I submitted a question, and my question was, can you please respond to Trump banning critical race theory in federal agencies? And I got a reply, and it said, congratulations, your question has been approved. And, you know, I'm nervous because, you know, I'm asking him a question that is slightly confronting, but, you know, I'm sure Sam could deftly either answer it or deftly avoid answering it while giving the impression that he is answering it. So we all hooked up on the Zoom, and a few questions were asked by other video panelists. They also had a running text thing where a moderator was taking questions from there. There were just the usual questions, but it just became fairly clear that it was going to be a Trump-bashing session, which I don't find very interesting, because there's never any substance to it. I'm sitting there ready to ask my question, and more Trump derangement syndrome, so I'm just sitting there rolling my eyes. One guy comes in and asks a question about social media and the evils of it, which he just did a podcast a week before this Q&A. So we're not going to hear anything new from that. So that was a signal that these are softball questions. Then another few questions were asked, which gave Sam another opportunity to bash Trump, you know, which is fine. It doesn't offend me, but it doesn't interest me either. Then Andrew Sullivan comes on because the moderator says, oh, I believe, Sam, we have a special guest. Like, none of us little people who are asking Sam a question, who we get the chance to ask this guy a question, none of us give a shit about special guests. Like, what the hell is the point of a special guest? So Andrew Sullivan comes on, and then it just becomes this, because keep in mind this Q&A is only going to be 60 minutes. And Andrew Sullivan comes on and just does more Trump derangement syndrome. So the two of them just back and forth bullshit about Trump. Andrew Sullivan's even worse. He has even less evidence when he bashes Trump. It's just so boring. So Andrew Sullivan eventually goes, I just don't get why you bring on another celebrity. So that ate up a lot of the time, at least half of the time. Then I think, okay, they're going to let me ask my question. But the next question was the same question about social media and its evils and the disconnection and everything. And these questions are being chosen by the moderator. So she knows she's now getting somebody else to ask a question that's already been asked. And I think even the way she introduced it was, oh, this question's kind of similar. So the guy asked the question, says, oh, sorry, Sam, it's a bit similar, but blah, 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 social media. Sam just answers it again with the same answer that we've just heard, which we already heard on a podcast a week ago. And then it was over. And so I knew I knew that my question was not going to get asked. I didn't know beforehand, but I got the... Because can you imagine if my question got asked after this Trump bashing? Hello, Sam, my name's Adam, and what do you think of President Trump banning critical race theory? Because I'm quite interested to hear your opinion, what with you not on the Trump train, but the two of you somehow, by proxy, have got the same ammunition and the same weapon against the woke. I would find his answer to be interesting. Now, I don't know what his answer was, because since then he hasn't said anything about it either. And, you know, he can't be seen to be supporting something like that Trump is behind, because that would destroy his his brand, I guess, or put a dent in it anyway. So, yeah, with Sam Harris, I mean, I for a while after that realization of the Democrats' sort of hands in all this mess, and Sam really sort of avoiding mentioning them in his pullback from the brink, I couldn't really listen to him, because all I could hear in that voice was just someone who's not prepared to go the whole mile. But since then I have listened to his podcasts. I mean, he has really interesting guests on, so I can still listen to him for that, but I can't watch Bill Maher anymore. I mean, he has nothing to say at all. It's kind of sad, because I used to like listening to these people. I cannot for the life of me work out why he just cannot unchain himself from that anchor, because, you know, I listen to Gad, I watch Gad Sad on YouTube, and he is constantly mentioning Sam Harris, not by name, as one of these I think he says highfalutin, you know, intelligentsia that wants to keep getting invited to these parties, will not leave the Trump hate cult. You know, 'cause you don't have to love Trump. You just got to state, you know, facts. You know, in a parallel universe, Sam Harris praises Trump for banning critical race theory in federal agencies. Your nemesis joins you in the fight against your enemy. That's highly interesting, but it's pretty obvious to me that I naively thought that question was going to get asked. I think they just probably approve all the questions, leading people to think their question's going to be asked. I don't know. But I was quite excited to ask him, because I thought, God, I'm going to get to ask him myself. But I'm a bit naive, I guess, in that situation. I mean, another thing that I found kind of amusing during that live Q&A was, one of the questions was, can you comment on either Brett Weinstein or Dave Rubin and their recent, not praise of Trump, but I mean, Dave Rubin does. He's quite obvious about it, but Brett Weinstein does not have a heavy dose of Trump derangement syndrome. Nowhere near as. I mean, Sam's got it bad. So he was given the choice by the moderator. Sam, do you want to talk about Brett Weinstein or Dave Rubin? And he went, ugh, rolls his eyes and goes, oh, I think I'll take Brett Weinstein, the less volatile grenade. Because Dave is an old school liberal, and he's going to vote for Trump. And, you know, Sam Harris used to be on Dave Rubin's show quite a bit. They used to talk quite a bit, but they haven't spoken in public on YouTube for a long time. It's kind of weird when all the people that you follow start to drift away from each other and others sort of move towards each other that you didn't expect. And it's just funny when you think that someone like Sam Harris, who's sort of supposed to be the godfather of the bullshit clearing weapon that he's supposed to be, apparently some bullshit is off limits. Anyway, so that's they're my feelings on Sam Harris really not making much sense. Okay, thanks.